Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the velvet curtains of an age when kingdoms rose and fell on gossip, daggers, and the kind of pillow talk that could get you executed by sunrise. Imagine yourself under a wool blanket in some drafty Frankish hall, the smell of wet straw and candle smoke clinging to everything. Outside, wolves prowl, hooves crunch through the frozen dirt, and monks scratch notes in Latin you'll probably never read. The world of the 6th century isn't exactly cozy, and honestly, you probably wouldn't survive more than a week here without catching something nasty or being accused of sorcery. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and the time where you're watching this. I love seeing how far across the world these stories wander. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You drift into the realm of Neustria, one of the shifting Frankish kingdoms that made up early medieval France. It's around the mid-500s, and the Merovingian dynasty is sprawled over Gaul like a patchwork quilt, each square sewn together by conquest, broken apart by feuding brothers, then hastily stitched again with marriages no one really wanted. The borders are vague. One year you're in Austrasia, the next your tax collector insists you owe Neustria instead. All the while peasants bend over muddy fields, while kings trade thrones like dice in a tavern game. In this dim setting, candlelight is your main technology. Forget glass windows. If you're lucky, a greasy scrap of parchment or thin horn covers the opening in your hut. To keep warm, you huddle by the fire and pray the thatch above doesn't catch sparks. And yet, despite all this roughness, royal. Courts gleam with silk and gold, hauled in through trading routes that snake from the Mediterranean. Picture it. A barefoot messenger tromps through muck for days just to deliver a bolt of Byzantine brocade that Fredegund herself might someday drape across her shoulders. Historians still argue whether we should call this period dark. On IUE, the one hand, cities shrank, literacy slumped, and a lot of Roman infrastructure collapsed. On the other, monasteries buzzed with learning, and Frankish kings like Clovis had already carved their names into Europe's memory. What you can't deny is that the world felt precarious. Power was fragile, and queens often wielded it from the shadows rather than the throne. That's where our main character, Fredegund, steps onto the candlelit stage. But hold on. Before she arrives, you need the stage itself. Neustria. Think of it as the western slice of the Frankish pie, running roughly from the Loire up to the Channel, anchored by Paris. It's a land of thick forests and muddy rivers where bishops act almost like warlords and kings squabble over estates and tribute. To the east lies Austrasia, another Frankish chunk ruled by competing cousins. The rivalry between Neustria and Austrasia is basically the family feud of the century, a grudge match that drags in entire generations. If you ever thought your Thanksgiving dinners were tense, imagine armies slaughtering each other because two queens had an argument. One mainstream fact to anchor you. The Merovingian kings liked to grow their hair absurdly long. Long hair wasn't just fashion, it symbolized their sacred right to rule. To shave a prince was basically to dethrone him. So when you picture this world, imagine men with flowing locks that would make a heavy metal guitarist jealous, striding around in fur-trimmed cloaks. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some of these same kings loved to keep trained bears as pets. Picture a grumpy monarch strolling through his garden with a hulking bear tugging on a chain. Part status symbol, part medieval flex. Honestly, you'd think twice before declining that dinner invitation. Now imagine yourself drifting further into this candlelit Neustria, hearing gossip ripple through taverns about kings who can't stay married and queens who seem to have 9 lives. That's the soil from which Fredegund will claw her way upward. She doesn't begin as royalty. She isn't even noble. She's just a servant girl with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. But she's about to enter the palace through the side door, and once inside, she'll never leave. Already, you feel the tension of a world built on shifting alliances. Neustria isn't a stable kingdom so much as a chessboard constantly tipped by clumsy hands. Marriages are pawns, churchmen are bishops, and kings think they're kings. But sometimes the real players are the queens, whispering strategies in the flicker of lamplight. Fredegund will prove that sometimes the most dangerous piece isn't a crowned monarch, but a woman who knows when to smile and when to strike. But for now, let yourself linger in this early scene. Fires crackle in a drafty hall, a scribe dips his quill into dark ink, and gossip simmers just beyond the torchlight. Somewhere in that background murmur, Fredegund's name is already beginning to rise. You hear the name Fredegund whispered like smoke curling between rafters, but when you try to follow the sound, it slips into the shadows. That's because her beginnings are cloaked in near silence. No grand genealogy scrolls, no statues in marble, just scraps of rumour and the disdainful notes of monks who didn't care much for low-born girls who clawed their way into history. She starts as a servant, in the household of King Chilperic I, ruler of Neustria. Picture her carrying pitchers of wine or straightening furs on the royal bed, invisible in her low rank but sharp enough to notice every smirk and slip in conversation. It's easy to imagine her eyes always watching, measuring which noble favours, which who lingers too long in the king's company, and which jealous glance could someday be used as a weapon. In a world where information is currency, a servant in the right room can be richer than a duke. Historians still argue whether Fredegund was born enslaved, free, or something in between. Some chronicles paint her as a literal nobody, perhaps even a slave girl raised in the palace kitchens. Others suggest she came from a minor Frankish family, just obscure enough to be dismissed as lowborn. Either way, what matters is how little her start prepared you to expect what was coming. If history were a card game, Fredegund begins with a hand full of 2s and 3s, yet she somehow bluffs her way into holding aces. The mainstream fact here, by the mid-6th century, Frankish queens weren't just ornamental. They might not wear crowns in battle, but they controlled estates, arranged marriages, and whispered in the ears of kings. Their signatures could authorize charters, and their patronage could elevate entire monasteries. Power was there for the taking, if you had the guts, the beauty, and most importantly, the cunning. Fredegund had all three, and now for your quirky tidbit, the Frankish elite adored jewelry so much that archaeologists keep finding tiny makeup kits in their graves. Little boxes for perfumes and cosmetics. Imagine a young Fredegund sneaking a glance at some noblewoman's gilded compact, already plotting how to someday own one herself. Beauty wasn't just vanity, it was political currency. The shimmer of gold beads on a veil could catch a king's eye faster than a sermon ever could. As you picture her life in those early palace days, remember that gossip was like wildfire. Every scullery maid knew who had quarrelled at dinner, which envoy had tripped on the rushes, and whether the king smiled too long at a guest. Fredegund would have lived in that electric atmosphere, a place where listening could be more dangerous and more rewarding than speaking. You might imagine her humming softly as she pours wine, but inside she's memorizing the exact words a noblewoman used to insult another. Now, if you lean closer, you can hear the shape of her opportunity forming. King Chilperic had a habit of treating wives as disposable, trading them like cloaks he grew tired of. His court was a revolving door of queens, and each arrival meant upheaval among the servants. That's where Fredegund's story begins to heat. She wasn't destined to carry trays forever. She was destined to slip through cracks, finding opportunity where others only saw peril. Historians still argue whether Fredegund truly caught the king's eye in some dazzling moment. Maybe during a feast when torchlight flickered across her hair, or whether her ascent was slower, more deliberate, like ivy climbing a wall. The chronicles we have, written by Gregory of Tours and others, are far from neutral. They tend to make her into a scheming temptress because, let's face it, medieval churchmen loved a villainess. Whether that's fair or slander, you'll have to decide as the story unfolds. Now, let's pause for a little modern aside. Imagine the resume you'd need today to become queen. Ivy League education, philanthropic projects, Instagram-ready poise. Fredegund's resume? Good with linens, decent at pouring wine, excellent at stabbing rivals in the back, sometimes literally. Honestly, makes you rethink your own career ladder, so you linger in this atmosphere. The palace corridors echo with footsteps, oil lamps smoke faintly against the stone, and in the corner of your eye, you spot her. Young Fredegund, moving silently, but with a purpose you can't quite name yet. She's already rehearsing the role she'll someday seize. Servant, mistress, queen. The titles will change, but the eyes, they never stop calculating. As you let your mind drift deeper into the flickering half-light of Neustria, you realize that Fredegund's story doesn't begin in grand halls or battlefields. It begins in whispers, in sidelong glances, and in the kind of silence that hides ambition. And if you listen carefully, you can almost. You're still standing in those smoky Neustria corridors, and now the stage widens to include King Chilperic III himself. He's not exactly the most admirable monarch, more like the Frankish version of that friend who can't stay in a relationship longer than a season. His affections swing like a weather vane, and every turn leaves a trail of drama. By the time Fredegund comes into his orbit, Chilperic already has a reputation. He'd married multiple times, discarded queens when it suited him, and sired more children than he could probably name on a bad day. Historians still argue whether his restlessness was purely personal whimsy or part of a broader political strategy, since every marriage linked him to powerful allies. Either way, it created a revolving door of royal women and an opportunity for someone clever enough to exploit the chaos. Here's the mainstream fact to anchor you. Chilperic was the son of the great Clotaire Thache, one of Clovis's successors, and by the 560s he ruled Neustria from Soissons. He's often described as cruel and greedy, a man who taxed heavily, seized church property, and once even composed bad poetry. Yes, you heard that right. Gregory of Tours snidely remarked on his literary talent, which, to put it kindly, did not survive the test of time. Imagine a king forcing his court to sit through awkward open mic nights where no one dares boo. And here's your quirky tidbit. Chilperic loved to hunt so obsessively that entire swathes of woodland were basically his private playground. There are stories of him charging through forests on horseback, dogs baying, servants tumbling after him. You can almost hear him returning sweaty and exhilarated, only to toss his muddy cloak into a servant's arms, perhaps into Fredegund's hands, who would watch silently, storing away every detail of his temper. Now picture the queen at that time. Audovera. She'd borne him several children, but in Chilperic's court, that wasn't insurance against being pushed aside. Chronicles suggest Fredegund had already caught the king's attention, maybe through charm, maybe through a well-timed smile, or maybe through something more deliberate, an understanding that his heart wandered, and she could anchor it, if only for a while. One whispered conversation, one moment of vulnerability, and suddenly the king's gaze lingered longer than it should. Historians still argue whether Audovera was forced out solely because of Fredegund or whether political convenience played the larger role. What's certain is that Fredegund began her transformation from background servant to visible presence, and that's where the palace dynamics shift. Imagine the tension in the hall, Audovera stiffening as she notices her husband's eyes drift toward a mere maid, nobles murmuring about how disgraceful it was, and Fredegund? She probably just kept pouring wine, head bowed, but inwardly glowing with the knowledge that she'd been noticed. It's easy to smirk at Chilperic's fickleness, but in his world, wives weren't chosen for love. They were pawns in dynastic strategy. The irony is, in dismissing queens so casually, he opened the back door for someone like Fredegund, a pawn who would soon flip the board entirely. Now, for your modern aside, imagine if CEOs today could swap out their spouses as casually as they swap PR teams. Shareholders might revolt. Twitter would explode. But in Chilperic's Neustria, it was just another Tuesday. As you trail along in the candlelight, you can sense how dangerous this game is. Servants rarely step into royal beds without consequence. For every Fredegund who rose, countless others probably fell, exiled, punished, forgotten. But she wasn't playing for survival, she was playing for the crown itself. That kind of audacity crackled around her like static, even in these early days. So here you are, watching Chilperic's affections dart about like a sparrow in a hall. Audovera grows uneasy, nobles mutter about impropriety, and Fredegund keeps her silence. But behind her, silence lies calculation. The king's fickleness is her golden ticket, and she knows exactly how to cash it. and as the fires crackle lower in that draughty Neustria palace, you realize the pattern is set. Kings with wandering eyes, queens discarded like garments, and one servant girl sharp enough to turn the system against itself. Before long, the king's fickle affections will topple an entire dynasty into scandal, murder, and war. The rushes crunch softly under your feet as you follow the murmurs toward one of the most infamous nights in Frankish history. The palace air is thick, torches sputter against damp stone, and whispers coil like smoke. Queen Galswintha is dead. To back up, Chilperic had married Galswintha, a Visigothic princess from Hispania, after pushing aside poor Audovera. This match was no small fling. It tied Neustria to the powerful Visigothic kingdom, a serious diplomatic win. Galswintha arrived with glittering dowry chests, lands, treasures, and the prestige of her royal blood. But Chilperic's old habits didn't die easily. No sooner had she crossed the threshold than his eye began to wander. And who do you think stood ready in the shadows? Fredegund. The mainstream fact here: Gregory of Tours, the cranky bishop chronicler of the age, tells us that Chilperic soon tired of Galswintha and wanted to return to Fredegund. This wasn't just about lust, having. Galswintha meant tolerating her stern disapproval of his mistresses, and Fredegund was not the kind of woman to vanish quietly. The clash between queen and servant mistress made the air in the palace so thick with tension you could slice it with a dagger. And speaking of daggers, enter the crime. One night, Galswintha was found strangled in her bed. The culprit was never officially proven, but let's just say no one was particularly shocked. Historians still argue whether Chilperic himself ordered the murder or whether Fredegund took matters into her own hands. Some claim it was a hired servant who crept in, with silent hands. Others whisper that the king himself helped hold the rope. And Fredegund? She emerges from the scandal untouched, her position only strengthened. If court politics were a game of Clue, everyone suspected it was Fredegund in the bedchamber with a strangling cord, but no one dared say it aloud. Here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval people often believed that the corpse of a murder victim could bleed afresh in the presence of the killer. Imagine poor Galswintha's body laid out, nobles nervously watching for supernatural signs, while Fredegund glides by serene, daring the blood to betray her. No record says it happened, but you can picture the hushed awe as she remained untouched. By superstition, the fallout was enormous. Galswintha wasn't just any queen. She was the sister of Brunhild, who was married to Chilperic's brother in Austrasia, and Brunhild was not the type to shrug and move on. This single murder lit the fuse of one of the longest and bloodiest rivalries in Merovingian history, Fredegund versus Brunhild, a feud that would outlive both women and consume kingdoms. Imagine the scandal as gossip spread across Gaul. Pilgrims whispered about it in monasteries, merchants carried the tale along trade routes, and nobles hissed the story over feasts. To murder a queen was bad enough, but to replace her instantly with the servant mistress everyone already loathed, that was pure tinder for a civil war. Let's pause for a modern aside. You know those celebrity scandals that dominate headlines for months, with podcasts dissecting every tiny clue? That was Galswintha's murder for the 6th century. No one could stop talking about it. The only thing missing was a medieval TMZ camped outside the palace. Historians still argue whether Galswintha's death was a carefully orchestrated coup by Fredegund or simply another rash act by Chilperic, who had a habit of making disastrous decisions. What's undeniable is that from this point forward, Fredegund is no longer just the ambitious mistress. She's a queen, and not just any queen. A queen tainted by the suspicion of murder, wearing her crown with blood still metaphorically dripping down its edges, so you linger in that torchlit hall. Servants scurry nervously, courtiers exchange loaded glances, and somewhere in the shadows, Fredegund straightens her shoulders. Galswintha is gone. The Visigothic dowry has been claimed. The throne beside Chilperic is hers. The scandal is enormous, but scandal has never frightened Fredegund. If anything, it's her natural climate, and so, with the cords of Galswintha's bed still cooling, the path is cleared. Fredegund, the servant girl, the mistress, now becomes queen, and the feud her ambition unleashed will rage for generations. Long after this night's whispers fade, the flicker of firelight now glints off silk and jewels, because you're no longer looking at a maid scurrying with pitchers. You're looking at a queen seated on the dais. Fredegund has slipped into Galsvintha's place almost seamlessly, like a shadow simply taking the shape of its host. But don't be fooled by the shimmer of her coronation robes. She's not here for ceremony. She's here to survive, and more importantly, to rule. The mainstream fact to anchor you. After Galsvintha's suspicious death, Chilperic married Fredegund formally, elevating her from mistress to queen consort of Neustria. This wasn't a secretive arrangement, it was recognized and sealed, making her a legitimate political player in the Merovingian world. In one fell swoop, she had leapfrogged every obstacle of birth, bloodline, and status. And here's your quirky tidbit. Coronation feasts in the Frankish court weren't delicate affairs with crystal goblets and polite clapping. They were boisterous, messy, and sometimes violent. Entire oxen were roasted, goblets sloshed with mead, and fights could break out as nobles jostled for seats closer to the royal couple. Somewhere in the chaos of her first feast as queen, the flicker of firelight now glints off silk and jewels, because you're no longer looking at a maid scurrying with pitchers. You're looking at a queen seated on the dais. Fredegund has slipped into Galsvintha's place almost seamlessly, like a shadow simply taking the shape of its host. But don't be fooled by the shimmer of her coronation robes. She's not here for ceremony, she's here to survive, and, more importantly, to rule. The mainstream fact to anchor you. After Galsvintha's suspicious death, Chilperic married Fredegund formally, elevating her from mistress to queen consort of Neustria. This wasn't a secretive arrangement, it was recognized and sealed, making her a legitimate political player in the Merovingian world. In one fell swoop, she had leapfrogged every obstacle of birth, bloodline, and status. And here's your quirky tidbit. Coronation feasts in the Frankish court weren't delicate affairs with crystal goblets and polite clapping. They were boisterous, messy, and sometimes violent. Entire oxen were roasted, goblets sloshed with mead, and fights could break out as nobles jostled for seats closer to the royal couple. Somewhere in the chaos of her first feast as queen, Fredegund might have sat poised, sipping delicately, while a drunken noble tripped into the fire pit behind her. Imagine her not even flinching, because compared to strangling rivals, spilled wine was child's play. But beneath the glitter, her enemies seethed. Chilperic's children by Audovera, his former queen, regarded Fredegund as a usurper, the wicked stepmother straight out of a medieval cautionary tale. Nobles loyal to Galsvintha muttered in corners, and of course, Brunhild, Galsvintha's sister in Austrasia, was already sharpening her vendetta. You can almost hear the crackle of tension, like logs snapping in the fire. Fredegund's throne was solid gold on the outside, but inside it was a tinderbox. Historians still argue whether Fredegund truly loved Chilperic or whether she saw him simply as her vessel to power. Some sources hint at real affection. She bore him many children and defended his interests fiercely. Others suggest she manipulated him expertly, whispering poison into his ear until he couldn't distinguish her ambition from his own. It's probably some messy mixture of both, as most marriages are. You wander through the royal hall, noticing how Fredegund begins to wield her influence. She arranges alliances, distributes favors, and, perhaps most dangerously, listens. Queens, in this period, didn't need to swing swords themselves. They just had to know which noble had debts, which bishop had enemies, and which servant could be persuaded to slip a pinch of poison into a goblet. Power for her was less about brute force and more about invisible threads pulled in the dark. Here's a modern aside to keep your eyelids heavy. Imagine if your office politics at work involved literal daggers and exiles instead of passive-aggressive emails. Suddenly, Becky from accounting doesn't seem so bad. Fredegund, though, she would have thrived in your office. HR wouldn't stand a chance. Even the church had to reckon with her new station. Bishops might mutter about her scandalous rise, but once she wore the crown, they had little choice but to treat her as the anointed consort. And in a time when kings leaned heavily on clerical legitimacy, Fredegund's ability to navigate their disapproval with charm or with threats was crucial. Now, pause for a sensory moment. Hear the clatter of goblets, smell the roasted boar. Seasoned with garlic and herbs, see the torchlight flashing on jeweled brooches. In the center of it all sits Fredegund, once a servant, now crowned. She smiles faintly, but her eyes scan the room, noting which noble refuses to toast her health, which bishop swallows his words, which stepson scowls into his cup. It's the kind of scene that tells you everything about her. She's not just basking in her new title. She's already planning how to keep it. And if that means daggers in the night or poison in the chalice, well, she's proven she can live with blood on her hands. So, from servant to queen, she now reigns beside Chilperic. The palace that once ignored her now revolves around her. And the scandal of Galsvintha's death fades into something more dangerous. The normalization of Fredegund as the undisputed queen of Neustria. But remember, the higher the crown, the sharper the knives pointed at it. And Fredegund has never been one to wait for her enemies to strike first. The hall grows colder, not because the fire has burned low, but because a shadow stretches from Austrasia into Neustria. You can almost hear the hiss of Brunhild's name, carried on the wind. Galsvintha's sister, the queen of Chilperic's brother Sigebert, is not the type to sigh and pray for patience. No, Brunhild sharpens her grief into steel, and with that, the feud begins. The mainstream fact anchoring you here. Brunhild and Fredegund's rivalry becomes one of the defining dramas of the Merovingian age. It isn't just a spat over a dead sister. It escalates into decades of war, assassinations, propaganda, and family betrayals. Imagine an epic Netflix series stretched across generations, each season bloodier than the last, with these two queens as the main characters. It begins almost immediately after Galsvintha's murder. Brunhild presses Sigebert to avenge her sister, and Sigebert obliges, taking up arms against Chilperic. The Frankish kingdoms fracture into open conflict. On one side, Austrasia and its allies rally behind Brunhild and her husband. On the other, Neustria stands under Chilperic and Fredegund's banner. The battlefield becomes the stage where private grudges explode into public carnage. Here's your quirky tidbit. Warriors in these clashes didn't wear neat, matching uniforms. Instead, they were a chaotic tapestry of fur cloaks, iron helmets, and the occasional shiny Roman relic looted from some forgotten villa. If you'd stumbled onto the field, you might have mistaken it for a rowdy medieval cosplay convention, until the swords started swinging. Back in the palace, Fredegund is watching carefully. She knows Brunhild is dangerous, not just because of armies, but because of her reputation. Brunhild comes from royal Visigothic blood, a princess raised in refinement. Fredegund, by contrast, is mocked as a jumped-up servant. That sting of insult fuels her cunning. If Brunhild thinks she's the real queen, Fredegund is determined to prove otherwise, not with noble lineage, but with raw survival instincts. Historians still argue whether the feud was truly personal. 2. Women battling over honor, or whether they simply became symbols of the broader power struggle between Neustria and Austrasia. It's probably both. Personal slights in this era were inseparable from political stakes, and queens weren't ornamental. They were engines of war. Picture yourself sitting in the Neustria court as messengers stumble in, mud-caked and breathless, announcing defeats and victories like weather reports. Chilperic fumes, pounding fists on tables, but Fredegund listens. In silence, her mind already spinning with counterplots. She isn't a general on the field, but she's a strategist in the chamber. Her battlefield is the royal bedchamber, the council meeting, the whispered promise of a reward to a wavering noble. Here's a modern aside for you. Think of Fredegund and Brunhild like two rival CEOs of massive family-owned companies. They don't just fight over profits. They fight over who gets invited to Thanksgiving dinner, who sits at the head of the table, and who can erase the other's name from the family portrait. Only difference, instead of lawsuits, they use swords, poison, and assassins. Imagine Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, but with crowns and blood feuds. Fredegund's first moves in this rivalry aren't to face Brunhild directly, but to strengthen her. Grip on Chilperic. She ensures her place as his indispensable partner, pushing away rivals, securing her children's inheritance, and quietly eliminating threats at court. Every step she takes, she has one eye on Brunhild, knowing that the Visigothic queen will not rest until vengeance is paid in blood. Now, pause in the silence of the torchlit hall. Hear the scrape of swords being sharpened in distant camps. Smell the tang of iron and wet wool as warriors prepare. See the map laid out on the king's table, pins marking towns that might burn tomorrow. And at the edge of it all, Fredegund leans closer, whispering strategies that are as deadly as any sword stroke. The feud with Brunhild isn't just a subplot in Fredegund's story. It's the fire that will consume nearly every decision she makes, the constant drumbeat behind her rise and reign. And in this moment, as war flares between Neustria and Austrasia, you can feel the shape of decades of conflict being born. Because when queens feud, kingdoms bleed. And Fredegund, once the servant girl, now sits in the eye of the storm, ready to turn even grief itself into a weapon. The corridors of Neustria grow quieter, but don't let the hush fool you. It's not peace, it's plotting. You can almost hear it if you press your ear to the cold stone walls. Whispers curling like smoke, the shuffle of parchment with hidden letters, the clink of goblets being slid into the wrong hands. This is where Fredegund thrives, not on the battlefield, but in the murky theatre of conspiracy. The mainstream fact anchoring you here: multiple chronicles accuse Fredegund of masterminding assassinations against her rivals. The most notorious target was her brother-in-law, King Sigebert of Austrasia, Brunhild's husband. As the feud between the two queens boiled, Sigebert scored decisive victories against Chilperic, cornering him and threatening Neustria's very survival. At the moment of his triumph in 575, just as he was being declared king over both realms, Sigebert was murdered, stabbed by two assassins reportedly acting on Fredegund's orders. Talk about bad timing for Brunhild. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some versions of the tale, the assassins concealed their weapons in hollowed-out canes, strolling casually into camp as if they were merely carrying walking sticks. It's a detail that makes the whole affair feel half medieval spy thriller, half slapstick comedy. Imagine a deadly agent leaning on a cane, then suddenly pulling out a dagger like he's in a bizarre magic show. The murder of Sigebert sends shockwaves through the Frankish kingdoms. In an instant, Brunhild goes from Queen of Austrasia to widow with a young son, while Fredegund secures her husband's shaky throne. You can almost see Fredegund pouring Chilperic's wine that night, her smile faint, her voice soft, while the king breathes easier knowing his brother is gone. Historians still argue whether she truly orchestrated the assassination or whether the chroniclers exaggerated her role to fit their villainous narrative. But you can feel the pattern, can't you? When rivals rise too high, they mysteriously fall. Inside the palace, the atmosphere thickens. Nobles tread carefully, never knowing whose favor is rising and whose life is about to end. Courtiers lower their voices, servants bow lower than usual, and bishops cross themselves whenever Fredegund enters the room. And she? She walks calmly, a queen accustomed to being the eye in a hurricane of fear. Here's a modern aside. Imagine if your office politics involved not just backstabbing emails, but actual stabbing. You're trying to eat your lunch while two co-workers argue whether Sheila from accounting poisoned the coffee. HR would need a full-time morgue. That was life in Neustria, except the HR department was Fredegund herself, and it's not just kings who fall to her plots. Lesser nobles, courtiers, even bishops are caught in her net. Stories swirl of poison slipped into chalices, pillows pressed too firmly over sleeping faces, and suspicious fires breaking out in the homes of her enemies. Some accounts even suggest she practiced trial by pillow talk, luring confidences from men in bed only to later betray them. Whether these tales are exaggerations or glimpses of truth, they reinforce her legend as a spider at the center of the web. Historians still argue whether she was truly as bloodthirsty as described or whether male chroniclers, uncomfortable with a powerful woman, demonized her to make sense of her success. After all, ambitious kings are praised for ruthlessness, while ambitious queens are branded as monstrous. Perhaps Fredegund was no worse than her male counterparts. She was just better at surviving. Now, lean closer into this murky hall. The torchlight flickers, shadows slither up the walls, and a servant slips silently into a noble's chamber with a tray of wine. Is it safe to drink? Is the smile on his face genuine or rehearsed? That's the mood of Neustria under Fredegund. Every goblet, every whisper, every glance carries the weight of potential doom. But she isn't finished. Assassination isn't a one-time trick. It's a habit, a language, a rhythm of power. And, as you drift deeper into her story, you begin to realize, for Fredegund, the shadows were never just a hiding place. They were her throne. You settle deeper into the flickering hall, and now the story tilts toward children, tiny, swaddled heirs who carry both promise and peril. Fredegund, now firmly seated as queen beside Chilperic, begins producing a brood of sons. In a dynasty obsessed with succession, this isn't just family life, it's dynastic survival. The mainstream fact to anchor you. Fredegund bore several children with Chilperic, though infant mortality was heartbreakingly common in this period. Some of her babies died within months, while others lived long enough to be drawn into the brutal politics of the court. The most important for our story will be Clothar II, born in 584, who survives the chaos to eventually rule over a united Frankish kingdom. But before you get there, the nursery itself is already a battlefield. Rumors swirl constantly about whether all of Fredegund's children were legitimate. Whispers accuse her of infidelity, suggesting that some sons might not be Chilperic's at all. Historians still argue whether these charges were slander spread by Brunhild's faction or whether Fredegund truly indulged in affairs. Either way, the gossip sticks, dripping like wax into every conversation about her heirs. Here's your quirky tidbit. In Frankish courts, babies were sometimes entrusted to wet nurses whose reputations mattered almost as much as their milk. A noblewoman might be judged by the honor of the woman who nursed her child. Imagine nobles leaning in at feasts, whispering not about the king's latest tax, but about whether the queen had chosen a trustworthy woman to breastfeed her infant. In Fredegund's case, you can bet every choice was scrutinized as another possible scandal. You picture Fredegund in the palace nursery, the smell of beeswax and wool blankets thick in the air, rocking an infant while watching the door for spies. She must have known that each child's survival, and the recognition of each one as truly royal, was a matter of life and death. A single rumor could brand an heir as illegitimate, opening the way for rivals to challenge their right to the throne, and rivals were everywhere. Chilperic's older sons from Audovera, his first queen, stood as obstacles to Fredegund's children. Every step they took in the palace echoed like a threat. It's no wonder later rumors accused her of plotting against them. Whether or not she truly did, it fit the image of a queen who never hesitated when her family's power was at stake. Here's a modern aside. Think of the drama of reality TV families, inheritances, rivalries, bitter step-sibling feuds. Now add battle axes, poison rings, and chroniclers eager to smear reputations. Honestly, the Kardashians look downright wholesome compared to the Merovingians. Historians still argue whether Fredegund actually committed adultery with various courtiers, as the gossip claimed, or whether these stories were deliberately planted to undermine her children's legitimacy. After all, labeling a rival queen as loose was an old political tactic. What we know for certain is that her children became magnets for intrigue, with each birth either strengthening her position or adding fuel to the fire of suspicion. Picture a court feast. Chilperic lifts his goblet proudly, announcing another son, while nobles politely toast but glance sideways at one another. In the corner, a bishop murmurs a prayer, wondering whether this child will live long enough to matter. And in the nursery, Fredegund herself smooths a linen blanket over the baby's chest, knowing every breath could shape the kingdom's future. Here's another sensory pause, the rustle of silk swaddling, the faint cooing of an infant, the sharp clink of a gold rattle gifted by some nervous noble. Behind the sweetness, though, you sense the tension. These aren't just babies, they're bargaining chips, targets, and weapons in the silent war of succession. So, as you lean into the dim glow of Neustria's palace, you see that Fredegund isn't just queen of a kingdom, she's queen of a nursery fraught with rumor and peril. Each child she cradles is another roll of the dice in her high-stakes game. And if whispers claim her heirs are illegitimate, well, Fredegund has never been the type to let whispers decide her fate. The palace. Halls grow heavier now, not with the scent of roasting boar or beeswax candles, but with whispers that crawl along the stone like damp moss. You've already seen how rumours clung to Fredegund's children, but here comes a darker turn: the scandal of her stepsons. The mainstream fact: Chilperic had several sons by his first wife, Audovera, among them Theudebert and Merovingian. These boys were older than the infants Fredegund bore, and by sheer seniority they posed a threat to her brood's succession. But as the chronicles gleefully report, the tension wasn't just political. Tales spread that Fredegund herself had befriended her stepsons far too intimately. In other words, accusations of liaisons between queen and stepchildren began to colour her reputation. Now, historians still argue whether there's any truth at all to these claims. Many see them as slander, juicy gossip crafted by her enemies, to paint her as not only murderous, but also incestuous. Others wonder if there might have been kernels of truth, especially since court life was already tangled with blurred boundaries, power games, and strategic seductions. The problem is, our sources are mostly monks, and monks had a tendency to crank every rumour up to 11. Here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval gossip wasn't confined to whispered corners. Sometimes it was sung, literally. Wandering bards and jesters carried tales between towns, tweaking details to make them rhyme or shock the crowd. Imagine a lute-strumming singer in a smoky tavern crooning about the queen who lay with her stepsons. Was it true? Probably not. Was it catchy? Definitely. So you walk with Fredegund through the palace corridors, sensing the daggers behind the stairs of courtiers. Every time she passes one of Chilperic's older sons, the air tightens. Did she smile too warmly? Did he bow too low? Every interaction became fuel for gossip. And gossip, in a world without newspapers, was more potent than any royal decree. The scandal took on a life of its own. Some chroniclers suggest that her stepson, Merovingian, even rebelled against Chilperic after being denied certain honours, and the gossip conveniently blamed Fredegund's influence. Was she seducing him for power? Or was the tale simply a way to smear her as a manipulative temptress pulling strings behind the throne? Historians still argue over where politics ends and slander begins. Pause for a modern aside. It's like when tabloids insist every celebrity is secretly dating their co-star because they were photographed standing next to each other at Starbucks. Only difference: in Fredegund's world, those rumours could literally start wars or lead to executions. Imagine TMZ with swords. Picture yourself in a dimly lit feast hall. Chilperic's sons eye their stepmother warily, the torches reflecting suspicion in their gaze. Nobles murmur into their goblets, bishops shift uncomfortably, and Fredegund herself, ever poised, keeps her smile measured. She knows the whispers, she hears the songs, and yet she doesn't flinch. She never does, because here's the deeper truth: whether or not the liaisons happened almost doesn't matter. The power of the rumour itself weakened her stepsons' credibility while strengthening her aura as a woman beyond constraint, a queen who couldn't be defined by ordinary rules. Her enemies thought the scandal would destroy her, but like wildfire, she simply learned to walk through it without being burned. So you linger in this tense atmosphere, hearing both the lullabies in the nursery and the bawdy tavern songs echoing through the countryside. The queen's reputation grows ever darker, ever sharper, as scandal after scandal is woven into her name. And though the stepsons' shadows still loom, Fredegund's ambition ensures that they'll never quite eclipse her. In Neustria, whispers are weapons, and Fredegund wields them as skillfully as any sword. The corridors echo differently now, less gossip, more growling. You've walked through scandal, whispers, and candlelit plotting, but tonight you step onto a battlefield. The air is raw, with iron and leather, banners whipping in the wind, the ground soaked with the stomp of hooves. This is the feud between Fredegund and her eternal rival, Brunhild, as it breaks out, not just in court intrigue, but in open war. The mainstream fact, to ground you: after Sigebert's assassination, Brunhild became regent for her young son in Austrasia. From that position, she rallied armies against Fredegund and Chilperic, launching decades of violent conflict between the two queens. What began as a dynastic dispute over succession spiraled into a prolonged blood feud, shaping Frankish politics for an entire generation. Here's your quirky tidbit. One chronicle mentions that Fredegund allegedly used witchcraft against her enemies, crafting little wax figures and melting them over fire to curse rival generals. Imagine her by lamplight, muttering while a wax soldier slumped into a puddle. Whether or not it worked, it gave her a reputation as not just cunning, but supernatural. In a world already steeped in fear of sorcery, that's one way to spook your enemies without even lifting a sword. You picture the two queens like chess players, except the board is Europe, and the pieces are entire armies. Brunhild, proud and politically savvy, uses alliances, especially with nobles and bishops, to strengthen her side. Fredegund, ever ruthless, strikes with assassinations, ambushes, and ruthless raids. Historians still argue whether their feud was primarily personal, two women clawing at each other out of spite, or whether it was the natural clash of competing dynasties in a fractured kingdom. Maybe it was both, tangled together so tightly that neither could be teased apart. Now let yourself stand on a Frankish battlefield. You hear the war horns blaring, the clang of swords, the guttural cries of men hurling themselves into combat. Dust stings your eyes. The air reeks of sweat and blood, and somewhere behind the lines, both queens wait for news. Fredegund doesn't fight with her own hands. She fights with orders, with assassins, with whispers sent out like arrows. Brunhild, meanwhile, maneuvers through diplomacy, arranging marriages and treaties to box her rival in. And the war isn't neat. It drags on for years, with villages burned, churches plundered, and peasants groaning under the weight of taxes to fund campaigns. To the average person, the feud of queens is less glamorous than deadly. You imagine yourself as a farmer, squinting at the horizon as two armies march past your fields yet again, trampling your wheat underfoot. You'd probably mutter, "These royal ladies really need a hobby." Modern aside here, it's like the world's messiest custody battle, except instead of arguing over weekends and holidays, they're arguing over entire kingdoms and the lives of thousands. And instead of lawyers, they've got armored knights with very pointy arguments. Fredegund's methods remain infamous. Some sources claim she personally directed ambushes from hidden positions, others that she kept a network of spies feeding her Brunhild's plans. It's said she even bribed generals to defect mid-battle, turning the tide without swinging a sword. Was she a military mastermind or simply opportunistic? Historians still argue, but either way, she proved deadly effective. And don't forget the psychological war. Rumors spread of her cruelty, her sorcery, her sheer audacity. To some, she became less a queen and more a phantom, the shadow waiting. Behind every curtain, the whisper that could topple armies. For soldiers facing her name, fear alone could weaken resolve. So as the dust settles over these battlefields, you realize you're no longer just watching one queen claw for survival. You're watching two titans locked in a duel that would shape the destiny of France. Their feud bleeds into every corner of the kingdom, poisoning alliances, shaking thrones, and ensuring that for decades, no one in Neustria or Austrasia could truly sleep soundly. And Fredegund? She thrives in the chaos. War is just another stage for her ambition, another theatre where her cunning outshines the clash of swords. You can almost see her now, standing on a tower, watching smoke rise from a burning village, lips curved in, that calm, unfaltering smile. The torches in the palace gutters burn low, and tonight your steps echo down a quieter corridor, one not lined with gossiping nobles or armored guards, but with priests, bishops, and the heavy scent of incense. This is where Fredegund's story takes on its next edge. Her troubled dance with the church. The mainstream fact. The Merovingian kings and queens relied heavily on the support of the Catholic Church to legitimize their rule. Bishops weren't just spiritual leaders. They were political powerhouses who could rally nobles, manage land, and sway public opinion. For Fredegund, who'd clawed her way from servant to queen, winning over, or at least controlling, bishops was essential. But here's the problem. Fredegund's reputation for murder, rumored incest, and witchcraft didn't exactly scream pious queen. Historians still argue whether her occasional gestures toward the church, lavish donations, sponsoring monasteries, were genuine acts of faith or just calculated political moves to offset her darker reputation. Picture her pressing gold into a bishop's palm with one hand while ordering a dagger into someone's ribs with the other. Your quirky tidbit: some chroniclers record that Fredegund once sought sanctuary inside a church when danger pressed too close. Sanctuary meant inviolability. Even hardened warriors wouldn't drag someone from the altar steps, but Fredegund, true to form, didn't just hide quietly. She allegedly brought assassins inside with her, ordering killings even while she clung to the holy space. Imagine priests trying to chant psalms while a stabbing happens 3 pews over. That's not exactly your model. Sunday service, step with me into the nave of a Frankish basilica. Cold stone walls, the shimmer of oil lamps, the murmur of Latin hymns. Fredegund kneels, veil pulled tight, lips moving in prayer. But outside those doors, her agents scurry, bribing some clerics, threatening others. The church becomes not a refuge of peace, but another chessboard where the queen places her pieces. Bishops loathed her unpredictability. Some railed against her from the pulpit, denouncing her sins as proof of royal corruption. Others, more pragmatic, accepted her gifts of land and treasure, quietly blessing her rule in exchange. The ambivalence is striking. She was both condemned and accommodated. Historians still argue whether her relationship with the church reveals her hypocrisy or her brilliance. Was she corrupting religion or merely exposing its political nature? Modern aside, if you think lobbying today is messy, imagine medieval lobbying, where your donation is an estate with a vineyard attached, and your threat is an assassin with a very sharp dagger. That's basically the playbook Fredegund worked from. The tension went both ways. The church needed the queen's support to expand monasteries and secure landholdings. Fredegund needed the church to gloss her reputation and provide spiritual justification for her reign. It was a toxic marriage, of convenience, one in which each side held its nose but clung to the benefits. You lean closer into the candlelight flicker of that uneasy truce, hearing the echo of sandals on stone floors, smelling the heavy resin of burning frankincense. For every monk praying sincerely for the queen's soul, another muttered darkly that she was beyond salvation. And Fredegund? She didn't seem to care, so long as their voices didn't unite against her. In this quiet corridor of her story, the queen shows a different kind of ruthlessness, not with swords, but with calculated piety. She knew the cross could be as useful a weapon as the dagger, and so she wielded both, kneeling just long enough to rise again, smile sharpened, ready for whatever came next. The night presses close again, and this time you're not in the perfumed halls of Neustria or the incense-laden basilicas. Instead, you follow Fredegund into a shadowy chamber, lit only by oil lamps. The shutters are drawn, and a nervous servant hovers at the door. Why? Because what happens here doesn't belong in daylight. This is the world of poison, daggers, and whispered contracts, the art of assassination. The mainstream fact: Fredegund became infamous for her use of assassins. Chroniclers like Gregory of Tours describe multiple instances where her enemies mysteriously dropped dead or were cut down by hired killers. One of her most notorious attempts was arranging an ambush against King Guntram, her late husband's brother, though it failed. These weren't random stabbings in dark alleys, they were carefully planned moves to shift the balance of power. Here's your quirky tidbit: medieval poison wasn't just arsenic or hemlock. Recipes mixed bizarre ingredients like ground pearls, crushed emeralds, and even animal parts, supposedly to increase potency. There are stories of toads being dried and powdered into a curse dust. Whether effective or just gross, these concoctions became part of a queen's arsenal. Picture Fredegund coolly instructing a servant, yes, grind the emerald finer, no lumps. Now, historians still argue whether Fredegund personally orchestrated every assassination attributed to her, or if later chroniclers exaggerated to craft a villainess for their morality tales. Was she really behind every sudden death? Or did enemies simply die from the era's rampant diseases, their passing conveniently blamed on the notorious queen? The debate still swirls, because our sources were as prone to drama as any modern gossip column. Imagine yourself crouched in that lamplit chamber, watching her roll a wax tablet across the table. On it are names, each etched like a death sentence. A noble who betrayed her, a bishop who denounced her, a rival cousin of Chilperic. Fredegund's voice is low but steady. The kind of voice you hear in someone who's learned survival means eliminating threats before they grow. She doesn't shout, she doesn't rage, she simply orders. And somewhere in the night, a hired blade mounts a horse. Modern aside, it's almost like scrolling through your contacts list and deciding who to unfriend, except instead of losing your Instagram likes, you lose your head. Brutal, but efficient. These killings weren't just about bloodlust. Each one cleared a path. Remove a rebellious noble, and a loyalist inherits the land. Eliminate a rival claimant, and your child's position strengthens. Poison an outspoken bishop, and the next one might keep his sermons more cautious. It's cold arithmetic, the same way modern strategists tally votes or dollars. Only difference, Fredegund's numbers were written in blood, and yet, for all her reputation, she wasn't. Untouchable. Assassins failed, some were caught and confessed under torture, naming her as the hand that guided them. That only deepened her infamy, painting her as a spider at the center of a deadly web. Did she flinch? No. Every time she adjusted, found new pawns, and sharpened her plans. Step outside now into the darkened streets of Paris, a cloaked figure slipping past you with a dagger tucked under his cloak. You don't need to ask who sent him. The city knows. The rumors hum like flies. If someone important falls tonight, it's Fredegund's doing. Whether she actually gave the order hardly matters. The fear itself works in her favor, making hesitation bloom in anyone tempted to cross her. So in this chamber of shadows, where oil lamps flicker and whispers shape destinies, you realize something chilling. Fredegund never truly needed armies to fight her wars. She needed only patience, a handful of loyal killers, and a reputation black enough to keep everyone guessing who might be next. And you, walking beside her, understand the lesson. In Neustria, survival isn't about being the strongest on the battlefield. It's about being the last one left when everyone else is gone. The night shifts again, and now you're in a quieter, more intimate space. No assassins lurking, no bishops glowering, just the hush of a royal nursery. The air is thick with beeswax and milk. A cradle creaks softly, and somewhere a wet nurse hums an old Frankish lullaby. Here you meet Fredegund, not as the schemer or the killer, but as the mother, holding in her hands the fragile future of Neustria. The mainstream fact. Fredegund bore Chilperic several children, but infant mortality was brutally high in the 6th century. Some of her children died young, while others grew to play major roles in Frankish politics. Her son Clothar II, for instance, survived long enough to eventually unify the Frankish kingdoms under his rule, making him one of the most important Merovingian kings. And here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval medicine for infants could get downright bizarre. Nurses sometimes rubbed crushed earthworms or bat's blood on a child's gums to ease teething, and one text recommended binding a wolf's tooth in cloth around a baby's neck as a charm against sickness. Picture Fredegund watching her nurse, carefully fasten a tooth on her baby like a tiny macabre necklace, and just nodding like, yeah, sounds legit. Historians still argue whether Fredegund's maternal devotion was genuine affection or a calculated way to secure her legacy. Did she weep as her infants died, or did she steel herself, thinking only of which child might live long enough to sit the throne? Our sources, mostly hostile towards her, tend to emphasize her cruelty over her tenderness. But even the hardest rulers often softened at the sight of their children. Perhaps, in those quiet hours, Fredegund allowed herself to simply be a mother. You. Picture her bent over a cradle, candlelight flickering against her face, watching her infant's chest rise and fall. In that fragile rhythm lies her entire gamble. A son surviving means her bloodline thrives, her enemies checkmated. A child lost means another opening for rivals to pounce. Every fever, every cough becomes a political crisis disguised as a domestic tragedy. And it wasn't just about health. Education mattered too. Princes were raised with tutors, learning Latin, law, and swordplay. But under Fredegund's eye, you imagine the curriculum tilting slightly. Lesson 1, darling, trust no one. Lesson 2, daggers solve arguments. Lesson 3, don't marry a Brunhild. That last one's extra credit. Modern aside, it's almost like helicopter parenting, except instead of worrying about college applications, she's worrying about keeping assassins out of the crib. The stakes are slightly higher. Yet even here, the shadow of death lingered. Several of Fredegund's children didn't survive infancy. Chroniclers sometimes hint darkly that she herself might have played a role in some of these deaths, perhaps eliminating weak heirs in favor of stronger ones. Historians still argue whether that's truth or slander, but either way, the whispers only deepened her aura of ruthlessness. And then there's Clothar, her survivor. You walk with her as she grips his tiny hand, whispering promises of crowns and vengeance. He'll live long enough to inherit her ambition, her cunning, and, if some accounts are to be believed, her ruthless streak. The boy raised in this tense nursery will one day become king, thanks in no small part to his mother's iron will. For a moment, though, the noise of court politics and battlefield horns fades. All you hear is the soft creak of the cradle, the rustle of swaddling cloth, and the tired sigh of a queen who has fought wars by night and now fights sleep by day. Here, Fredegund is no phantom assassin, no witch queen in the chronicles. She is just a woman, clutching her child in the half-light, daring the world to take him from her. The nursery's soft hum fades, and now you hear the stomp of boots, the clatter of shields, the shouts of soldiers being mustered. The scent of milk and beeswax is replaced by sweat, iron, and damp earth. Because tonight, you're no longer tucked in a palace corner. You're riding alongside Fredegund as she plunges into the world of war. The mainstream fact, though not usually leading armies herself, Fredegund had enormous influence over Neustria's military decisions. After Chilperic's death, she acted as regent for her son Clothar II, and during that time she directly commanded campaigns against Brunhild's Austrasian forces. This wasn't ceremonial influence. She directed strategy, ordered raids, and helped choose which lords to reward or punish after a battle. And here's the quirky tidbit. Frankish warriors sometimes charged into battle bare-chested, believing it showed both bravery and contempt for their enemies. Picture yourself trudging across a muddy field, trying to look intimidating while praying you don't catch pneumonia. That's one way to set a mood. Historians still argue whether Fredegund had genuine military skill or whether her victories were really due to the commanders under her. Chroniclers often sneer that women couldn't strategize, but the consistency of her survival suggests otherwise. Either she was an unusually lucky queen, or she truly had a mind for war. You picture her on the eve of battle, not in armor, but draped in a heavy cloak, speaking low to her generals. Her voice slices through the clamor. She knows which nobles to flatter, which ones to threaten, which ones to remind of the gold waiting for them if they triumph. She may not swing a sword, but she controls the men who do, and in the end, that's the sharper weapon. The battlefield itself is chaos. Dust rises, hooves churn mud, spears splinter, men shout in languages and dialects that only half overlap. You catch the metallic tang of blood mixed with churned earth, the acrid smoke of burning wagons. In this storm, Fredegund's orders ride, out like invisible threads. One noble told to flank here, another bribed to betray his cousin at the right moment. The battle is fought in steel, but also in whispers. Modern aside, it's a bit like watching someone play a high-stakes video game of Risk, except when you lose a piece, it's an actual cousin's head rolling in the mud. Sorry, Jeff, you should have guarded Australia better. Her fiercest opponent remains Brunhild, who often sent armies crashing against Neustria's borders. Each skirmish became more than a clash of swords. It was a personal grudge played out in mud and blood. Two queens, neither willing to yield, hurling men at each other like chess pieces that happened to bleed. And through it all, Fredegund proved she wasn't simply defending, she was maneuvering to ensure her son's eventual dominance. Of course, war brought its own strains. Soldiers could be disloyal, supplies could vanish, and plague often followed armies like an unwelcome camp follower. Chroniclers mention entire campaigns undone by disease rather than enemy blades. Fredegund knew this. That's why she leaned, not only on spears but on spies, ensuring that if disease didn't thin her enemies, a knife in the dark might. But don't imagine her as some aloof puppeteer. No, she was present. She walked the camps, her cloak brushing against tent ropes, her words binding soldiers to her cause. Men fought harder for a queen who appeared in the mud beside them, even if she didn't carry a sword. Think of her as part general, part propagandist, part mother of the nation. And when dawn broke over a victorious field, Fredegund's hand was already moving the next pieces into place. Defeated nobles, stripped of land, allies rewarded with new titles, her sons, claim woven tighter with every reshuffle. A battle wasn't just about who stood last, it was about who she allowed to rise again. So tonight, as you wipe the mud from your boots and hear the horns of retreat fading, remember, in the wars of Neustria, blades clashed, but it was Fredegund's will that drew the map. And that map, bloody, patched, and fiercely defended, was her gift and her gamble for her son. The clang of swords fades, and instead, you find yourself in the echoing aisles of a church. The air is cool, heavy with incense, and your boots squeak faintly against stone worn smooth by pilgrims. You're not here for worship, though. You're shadowing Fredegund as she maneuvers through the most powerful force after armies, the church. The mainstream fact. By the 6th century, bishops in the Frankish kingdoms were as much political operators as spiritual shepherds. A single bishop could swing public opinion, bless or curse a king, and control immense landholdings. Fredegund knew this, and she cultivated relationships with certain clerics while persecuting others. One bishop of Rouen, Praetextatus, famously clashed with her. He supported a rival marriage alliance and ended up stabbed to death at the altar during Easter service. Chroniclers didn't hesitate to blame Fredegund. Here's your quirky tidbit. Bishops in Gaul sometimes wielded military power. They might show up at councils in chainmail, carrying a sword under their robes. Imagine today's local pastor rolling up to Sunday service with a bazooka tucked under the pulpit. It gives armed with the word a whole new spin. Historians still argue whether Fredegund's faith was genuine or merely a mask for politics. Did she kneel sincerely at altars, whispering prayers for her children, or did she bow only to manipulate bishops into supporting her regency? Some accounts emphasize her piety, others her cynicism, leaving us to wonder if she wore religion like another weapon at her belt. Picture her moving through the dim nave of a cathedral, her cloak sweeping dust, as monks chant softly in the background. She stops at a bishop's side, pressing a jeweled gift into his palm. Her words are honeyed. For the glory of God, of course. But the subtext is clear. Support my son's claim, or find yourself outmaneuvered, perhaps even hunted. The church was supposed to deal in salvation, but here it dealt in crowns. Modern aside, it's not so different from politicians cozying up to influential megachurch pastors today, just with fewer microphones and more frankincense. The stage may have changed, but the hustle's the same. The story of Bishop Praetextatus brings this dance into stark focus. He dared to bless a marriage between rivals that threatened Fredegund's interests. Soon after, he was ambushed inside the sanctuary. Was Fredegund's hand behind the dagger? Gregory of Tours certainly thought so, and the rumor clung to her like incense to cloth. But again, historians debate, was she truly culpable, or was his death just one more convenient tragedy pinned on her by hostile chroniclers? You stand with her during those moments, feeling the tension. One bishop denounces her from the pulpit, his voice rising like thunder, and she just sits in her stall, unflinching, her gaze as cold as carved stone. Another bishop flatters her, calls her God's chosen queen, and she rewards him with land and gold. Slowly, carefully, she bends the church to her will, not entirely, never fully, but enough to keep her son's crown gleaming in the shadows. And yet, perhaps in quiet moments, she prayed. Even Gregory hints at her penances, her moments of contrition. Did she seek forgiveness for her assassinations? Or did she pray only for victory, believing God preferred her line, over Brunhild's. No chronicle gives us her inner voice. You have to imagine it yourself, her hands folded, her lips moving in candlelight, her heart caught between guilt and ambition. In this sacred space, where stone arches lift heavenward and voices echo with chants, you realize something. For Fredegund, the church was never just a house of God. It was a throne room by other means, another battlefield where allies could be forged and enemies cut down. The daggers were hidden, the blood invisible, but the stakes were just as high. The incense and candle smoke drift away, and you're pulled once more into the chill of open corridors. Now the air smells faintly of cold iron and wax-sealed parchment. This is the world behind the throne, the cloaked figures who whisper in corners, the agents who vanish into the night with letters tucked beneath their cloaks. Tonight, you move, with Fredegund's spies. The mainstream fact, espionage was no modern invention. In the Merovingian courts, spies were essential for survival. Envoy doubled as informants, servants carried gossip between noble houses, and messengers were bribed to misplace letters. Fredegund reportedly maintained a network of agents, feeding her information about rivals and sniffing out plots, before they ripened. Without these webs of whispers, her regency might not have lasted a month. And your quirky tidbit, one medieval method of secret communication involved writing messages in lemon juice. Heat the parchment over a candle and, voila, the words appeared. Imagine a grim Frankish spy squatting by a smoky fire, muttering, "Don't mind me, just roasting my mail." Historians still argue whether Fredegund orchestrated her spy, networked personally, or relied on capable lieutenants to handle the details. Some paint her as the mastermind, dictating every coded word, while others suggest she simply sanctioned what came naturally in a paranoid court culture. You follow her through the palace, torchlight flickering across the mosaics. A servant bows, low, pressing a folded scrap into her hand. Her expression doesn't flicker, but you sense the sharpness beneath her calm exterior. She tucks it into her sleeve without a word. That slip of parchment might hold the name of a noble wavering in loyalty, or an army set to march, or the whispers of Brunhild's newest intrigue. Modern aside, it's basically an early version of checking your notifications. But instead of 3 likes and a retweet, it's Count so-and-so plans to stab you tomorrow. Through spies, she didn't just react to plots, she planted them. Nobles found themselves accused of treason based on conveniently timed discoveries. Rivals quarreled over rumors that seemed to spread like wildfire, often to Fredegund's benefit. In this shadow war, truth mattered less than perception. A noble who merely appeared suspicious could be removed, leaving her son's position safer. The most chilling aspect is how invisible it all feels. You're walking down a hallway, and suddenly a lord disappears from court, exiled, imprisoned, or mysteriously dead. The others mutter about betrayal, but no one knows where the first whisper started. You suspect, though. The trace of Fredegund is everywhere, like perfume lingering after she's passed. And yes, those whispers reached Brunhild too. Both queens waged shadow wars, trading bribes, threats, and planted stories across kingdoms. Picture it like a medieval Cold War conducted entirely by carrier pigeon. You almost pity the birds, doomed to carry slander one way and assassination orders the other. Of course, even spies could betray. That was the curse of the system. Loyalty bought could always be sold again. Fredegund knew it, which is why she never relied too heavily on one agent. Her network was a tangle, so that if one thread snapped, the rest still held. It's the same logic you use with passwords today. Never trust just one, or you'll be hacked before you can blink. And in the middle of all this, she had to project calm. Imagine her walking into court with the serene poise of a queen, even as she silently ticks off which noble has been bribed, which is plotting rebellion, which is secretly in her pocket. To her, every smile is a mask, every bow a potential lie. No wonder chroniclers thought her paranoid. Honestly, in her position, paranoia was just good housekeeping. So as you trail behind her tonight, slipping deeper into the murmur of secrets, remember, her power wasn't just built on the sword, it was built on whispers in the dark, 1,000 half-truths stitched into a cloak that kept her son safe. In a kingdom where betrayal was as common as bread, Fredegund made sure she always knew which way the knives were pointing. The night closes in thicker now, torches sputtering in the wind as you follow Fredegund through quieter passages of the Ii palace. The soundscape changes, less of clashing swords or chanting monks, more of hushed sobs, muffled footsteps, and doors being barred. Because tonight you're lingering in the heart of her household, her children, her heirs, her hopes. Thearm, mainstream fact. Fredegund bore multiple children by Chilperic Foiche, though most did not survive childhood. Infant mortality was tragically common in the early Middle Ages, but Fredegund's record was especially grim. Sons and daughters died one after another, leaving only Clothar II to outlive her. Chroniclers claimed she resorted to desperate measures, prayers, and even dark magic to protect her offspring. And the quirky tidbit: Frankish midwives sometimes placed knives or iron tools under a baby's cradle to ward off evil spirits. The idea was that demons hated metal. Imagine tucking your newborn in with a butter knife for safety. Childproofing, Merovingian edition. Historians still argue whether Fredegund herself harmed some of her children to manipulate succession, or if those claims were later propaganda designed to blacken her name. Gregory of Tours, for example, accused her of smothering a daughter to deny Chilperic the joy of reconciliation. But others note that infant mortality rates were so high it may simply have been nature, not murder. You picture her rocking an infant. By firelight, her eyes shadowed, her lips pressed tight. Outside, the palace stirs with whispers of politics and betrayal, but inside this room, she's just a mother. Yet even here, the burden doesn't lift, because each child carries the weight of dynastic survival. If the baby coughs too long or fails to gain weight, it isn't just heartbreak. It's the collapse of a claim to the throne. Modern aside, it's like having a family group chat where every message is a cliffhanger. Did the baby make it through the night? Except instead of grandma worrying, it's the entire kingdom. Clothar, her most famous surviving son, became the focal point of her life. She plotted, schemed, and killed to secure his position, and he would go on to become the sole ruler of the Frankish kingdom. But before that triumph, she faced repeated loss. Sons named Clodebert, Samson, and Dagobert all died young. Each funeral was both a personal wound and a political crisis. You can almost hear the muffled bells tolling at dawn, the courtiers whispering about curses, God's punishment, or poisoned cradles. Some even believed Fredegund's rivals cursed her line, while others insisted her own sins brought divine retribution. She stood in the middle of this swirl, stone-faced, grief buried beneath ambition. Did she cry in private? Did she rage against heaven? No chronicler tells us, but you suspect she did both. In quiet moments, she may have clutched Clothar closer, murmuring prayers to saints whose statues she had bribed with jewels. She knew he was her last hope. Every plot, every battle, every midnight dagger would mean nothing if he did not survive. That realization sharpened her ruthlessness. She wasn't simply defending power, she was defending her child's life against a world that wanted him extinguished. And yet, the paradox remains. A woman accused of smothering her own daughter could hardly be painted as tender. Perhaps it's propaganda. Perhaps it's truth. The line between the two is as hazy as torch smoke. But you, standing here at the cradle, sense that motherhood for Fredegund was never soft. It was iron-willed, sharpened by grief, driven by survival. So when you hear the faint coo of baby Clothar in the shadows, imagine the weight pressing down on that tiny body. He isn't just a baby. He's the hinge of dynasties, the future of kingdoms, the justification for his mother's every ruthless act. And Fredegund, watching him breathe in the flickering light, knows she'll burn the world if that's what it takes for him to live. The cradle fades from sight, and now you're in a hall blazing with candlelight, the air thick with perfume and roasted meat. Voices rise, glasses clink, laughter echoes. Welcome to the battlefield with no swords, the feasting hall. Fredegund moves easily here, a predator in velvet, eyes sharp as blades. The mainstream fact: Merovingian courts revolved. Around ritualized banquets and assemblies, alliances were forged over goblets of wine, while grudges simmered under the clatter of plates. Who sat closest to the king mattered as much as military victory. Proximity equaled influence. The queen's presence at such tables wasn't ornamental. It was strategic. And the quirky tidbit: medieval banquets sometimes featured peacocks served whole, feathers reattached after roasting for dramatic effect. Imagine biting into a drumstick while the bird still glares at you from across the platter. Nothing like a side of intimidation with your dinner. Historians still argue whether Fredegund's charisma at table was truly magnetic or simply feared. Chroniclers often demonize her, but even enemies admitted she could charm nobles into forgetting their grievances, at least until the wine wore off. Was it genuine magnetism, or were they all just terrified of crossing her? The debate lingers like stale ale. You picture the scene: nobles lounging on benches, their boots muddy, their voices booming. A boar turns on a spit, juices hissing into the fire. Then Fredegund enters, cloaked in crimson, a jeweled cup in her hand. Conversations falter. She doesn't raise her voice, doesn't need to. She glides to her place beside Chilperic, or, later, alone, as Queen Mother, and suddenly every man in the room remembers his manners. Modern aside, it's like being at a tense office holiday party where the boss's spouse walks in, except instead of worrying about a bad karaoke performance, you're worrying about whether your head will still be attached tomorrow. At these banquets, Fredegund excelled at subtle games. A glance at one noble, a smile withheld from another, a toast that mentioned one ally's loyalty but conveniently skipped another's name. These were signals, carefully curated, and everyone read them like scripture. Entire fates turned on whether the queen offered you meat from her platter or left you to stew in silence, and always the rumors. Nobles whispered that some who left these feasts didn't make it home. Poison in the wine? A dagger waiting in the alley? With Fredegund, the line between hospitality and hostility blurred. A goblet could be a gift or a trap. Which one, you'd only know after drinking. One famous episode tells of her arranging a banquet where her stepson, Merovech, thought he might reconcile with her. Instead, he found himself cornered, his allies thinned out, his escape routes sealed. He would later be forced into rebellion, ending in his own tragic death. The feast table, it turned out, had been the first move in the game. The hall itself amplifies her strategy. Torches line the walls, tapestries dampen echoes, servants dart. In with trenches of bread and dripping roasts. She sits calm, surveying everything, a queen spider at the center of her web. Guests laugh too loudly, sip too slowly, weigh every word. You realize that for all the spilled ale and laughter, this is a deadlier battlefield than the open field. Here, a joke misjudged or a glance unreturned could brand you an enemy. So as you sit across from her, your goblet heavy in your hand, you're caught between thirst and fear. The wine gleams darkly in the torchlight. Her eyes glint over the rim of her cup, and you wonder if you've been invited here to celebrate, or to disappear. The feast fades into echoes, and now you find yourself in a quiet, chilly chamber, overlooking the palace gardens. Moonlight slips through latticed windows, casting shadows that dance across the stone floor. Here, Fredegund's mind is as active as any battlefield, plotting, calculating, weaving schemes that will ripple through Neustria for decades. The mainstream fact: Neustria's political landscape was a constant struggle of succession and loyalty. Every noble, every general, every bishop represented a potential threat or ally. Fredegund, understanding this, maintained a network of spies, informants, and personal confidants who kept her apprised of every whisper. She knew that knowledge was as lethal as any sword. The chill of moonlight recedes, replaced by the warmth of dawn spilling through high windows. You trudge through corridors, now lined with the quiet shuffle of servants preparing for another day of court. But Fredegund's presence fills the space like a shadow you can't shake. Today is about reputation, the image she projects, carefully curated over years of scandal, politics, and survival. The mainstream fact: medieval queenship required public performance as much as private influence. Fredegund's every gesture, Every greeting, every visible act of charity or devotion contributed to her authority. A queen's reputation could stabilize her son's reign or destabilize it entirely. Fredegund understood that power was as much about perception as it was about land or armies. Quirky tidbit, she reportedly maintained an entourage of dwarfs and jesters who served as both amusement and spies. Their antics distracted guests, but their eyes were everywhere. One can imagine a tiny jester performing a cartwheel while covertly observing a whispering noble, reporting back to the queen later. Efficiency and theatre combined. Historians still argue how much Fredegund consciously engineered her public persona versus letting her actions speak for themselves. Did she meticulously plan appearances, or did her infamy naturally shape how people perceived her? Either way, the effect was undeniable. Her image loomed larger than life, blending fear, fascination, and admiration. You follow her into the main hall, noticing how every eye shifts as she enters. Nobles bow lower, servants straighten, and whispers cascade through the room. She walks deliberately, lips pressed into a faint smile. A visitor missteps, clumsily spilling a goblet of wine, and you can almost hear the collective holding of breath. Fredegund doesn't flinch, but the message is clear. Chaos is tolerated only when she permits it. Modern aside, think of her like a CEO whose entrance into a room instantly changes the room's temperature. But instead of HR reprimands, the consequences might be exile, loss of land, or something far more permanent. Even within the family, her image matters. Clotha, now growing older, learns from example. Observing his mother's composure, his calm manipulation of courtiers, his father's old rivals subtly maneuvered around her. He internalizes that power isn't given, it's performed. Fredegund's legacy isn't just in the conquests she orchestrated, but in the lessons she impresses upon him daily. And yet, she tempers ruthlessness with ritual. Daily prayers, ceremonial gifts to bishops, and public displays of generosity remind Neustria that their queen is also pious. The dance between fear and respect is delicate, but she moves through it with grace. Her enemies might murmur, her allies might second-guess, but her authority remains largely uncontested. Imagine her pausing by a window, sunlight glinting off jewels in her hair, watching the courtyard fill with activity. You sense the weight of centuries pressing on her decisions, the delicate balance of family, politics, and the ever-present threat of betrayal. In every smile, every nod, and every glance, she communicates power. So as the day begins, remember, Fredegund's mastery of image is as lethal as any dagger, as enduring as any battle won. In a world where perception was often reality, she built herself into legend, not merely through her acts, but through the careful construction of a presence that could not be ignored. The sun climbs higher, and now you wander into the labyrinth of Fredegund's personal chambers. The walls are hung with tapestries that tell silent stories of conquest and faith, while the faint scent of lavender and burned candles drifts in the air. Here, her life becomes a blend of private ritual, calculated thought, and quiet terror. Management. The mainstream fact: queens in the Merovingian period often maintained separate households from the king, complete with their own staff, treasuries, and networks of influence. Fredegund controlled her own domestic sphere, but it doubled as a political tool, where her decisions, sometimes minor, sometimes deadly, shaped alliances, rewarded loyalty, and punished betrayal. Quirky tidbit. She is said to have used her dogs as part of her security detail, large and aggressive, patrolling her chambers and sometimes accompanying her on walks. Imagine a pack of snarling Frankish hounds padding behind a queen as she moves with quiet authority. Intimidation disguised as domesticated loyalty. Historians still argue whether Fredegund's household operated more as a center of maternal care or a nerve center of intrigue. Was she primarily a mother, a politician, or a master manipulator, combining both roles seamlessly? Accounts suggest the answer is all of the above, but separating truth from legend remains tricky. You follow her through a narrow hallway into her sitting room. She sits on a carved bench, tapestry shadows flickering across her face, a scroll in her lap. Courtiers would see only the serene queen, but her mind races. Letters to be dispatched, debts to be collected, alliances to be assessed. Even a missed bow or a flippant comment could ripple into deadly consequences if mishandled. Modern aside, imagine running a Fortune 500 company from your living room while simultaneously parenting toddlers, training assassins, and negotiating with rival CEOs who might also be plotting your downfall, all without cell phones. It's multitasking, Merovingian style. Her children move through the chambers quietly, observing, absorbing lessons in vigilance and authority. Clota, still learning the ropes, watches the subtle dance of attention and restraint. Every gesture, every word from Fredegund carries meaning. A nod to one servant, a smile withheld from another, a quiet reprimand in passing. All of it teaches him survival in a world where missteps can be fatal. And yet, even in these chambers, shadows linger. Courtiers sometimes whisper about the fate of rivals, the missing nobles, and the queen's rumoured hand in their disappearances. Some claim she tortured enemies in secret rooms. Others say she merely let fortune, or fear, do her work. Historians still debate how much of the horror attributed to her is fact versus later embellishment by writers eager to craft a legend. You notice her pause at a window, looking down on the gardens, where workers and soldiers move like chess pieces. Each decision she has made, each alliance she has forged, every enemy neutralized, comes together in this quiet observation. She is alone with her thoughts, yet connected to the vast web she controls. So as you linger in the hush of her chambers, it's clear that Fredegund's mastery isn't only in public displays, assassination plots, or battlefield strategy. It's in managing the everyday minutiae of life as both mother and monarch. Every scroll, every whispered message, every carefully orchestrated smile contributes to the kingdom she shapes from shadowed corners. The day wanes, and you follow Fredegund into a long gallery lined with portraits and tapestries that chronicle past Merovingian rulers. The polished stone floor echoes with your footsteps as she glides past, silent but commanding. This is where her sense of legacy comes into focus, how she wants to be remembered and how she manipulates memory itself. The mainstream fact, Fredegund was among the most controversial queens of the Merovingian dynasty, notorious for her political ruthlessness. Chroniclers like Gregory of Tours recorded her deeds in detail, though often with moral outrage, portraying her as a villainess who shaped history with cunning, ambition, and blood. And your quirky tidbit, medieval queens sometimes commissioned tapestries depicting themselves in heroic poses alongside kings, even if the events were exaggerated or entirely fabricated. One can imagine Fredegund inspecting a scene where she's depicted leading soldiers while wearing a crown the size of a small cartwheel. Self-promotion, Merovingian style. Historians still argue whether her portrayal in these accounts was deserved or a product of misogynistic exaggeration. Was she truly ruthless beyond measure? Or did chroniclers sensationalize her story because she wielded power so effectively as a woman in a male-dominated world? The debate endures, making her legend both terrifying and fascinating. You walk beside her as she pauses before a tapestry showing Chilperic, her late husband. Her hand hovers over the fabric, tracing threads that shimmer in the dying light. She is acutely aware that memory can be shaped, through gifts to monasteries, through sponsorships, through whispered stories in the corridors. Legacy is a battlefield no less important than the open fields of Neustria. Modern aside, it's like curating your Instagram feed to highlight only the triumphs, only the moments you want the world to remember. Except, in her case, your followers. Include an entire kingdom, and your rivals are lethal. Every portrait, every scroll, every commissioned work becomes a tool. Even accusations of murder or scandal reinforce her image. A queen who does not hesitate, who shapes events herself rather than being shaped. To contemporaries, this could seem monstrous. To Fredegund, it's pragmatism, the careful crafting of influence and memory. You glimpse her reflection in a polished shield propped against the wall. The face staring back is serene, almost contemplative, yet behind those eyes lies the calculation of decades. She has survived assassination attempts, feuds, the deaths of children, and the constant treachery of the court. Her mind is always 3 moves ahead, and the kingdom's perception is a chessboard she manipulates like a master. And her son? Clotha observes from a distance, learning the same lessons. Legacy is not just what you do in life, but how history will frame it. Fredegund ensures her son's narrative will overshadow rivals and secure her own memory as an indelible force, regardless of the scandals attached. So as you linger in the gallery, the tapestries flickering with torchlight, you realize that power is more than politics or war. It's the stories that survive you. And Fredegund, ever aware of her place in history, bends memory itself to her will, leaving a mark that endures long after the candles burn out. The gallery recedes, and now you walk with Fredegund through the twisting staircases of the palace. At twilight, the shadows grow long, creeping along the walls, and the distant clatter of the kitchens fades into a hush. This is the space of reflection, where she weighs victories, losses, and the delicate calculus of power that defines her every decision. The mainstream fact: as queen and later regent, Fredegund wielded remarkable influence in a period when women's roles were largely constrained. She survived multiple assassination attempts, navigated the treacherous Merovingian court, and ensured the survival of her lineage, which culminated in her son, Clothar II, becoming sole king of the Franks. Her political acumen was unparalleled for her time. Quirky tidbit. It is said that Fredegund sometimes consulted astrologers and dream interpreters to plan her moves. One chronicler records her asking whether a comet seen over Neustria heralded danger for her son, while another suggests she may have used birds' flight patterns to interpret omens. Imagine her, candlelight flickering, leaning close to a startled astrologer and whispering, "So, do we attack or not?" Historians still argue the extent to which these practices influenced her political decisions. Were they genuine beliefs or theatrical tools designed to intimidate and manipulate? It is likely a blend of both, illustrating the mix of superstition, performance, and strategy in her courtly conduct. You follow her up the spiral staircase, the stone steps worn smooth from decades of hurried feet. She pauses at a landing, gazing through a narrow slit at the city below. The streets seem calm, but she knows every rumor, every plot, every potential betrayal in real time. She has built a mental map of loyalty and threat, plotting not just today's moves, but decades ahead. Modern aside, it's a bit like tracking stock markets, social media trends, and political maneuverings all at once, but here the stakes are immediate survival and control of an entire kingdom. One wrong calculation could mean a rival on the throne, or worse, a dagger in the dark. Fredegund's genius lies in her balance. She manages public image, orchestrates political alliances, and manipulates fear without appearing overtly tyrannical. Her stepsons, nobles, and even enemy spies are all pieces in a game she plays with terrifying precision. And the most chilling part: she enjoys it, not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but mastery for survival and legacy. You hear the faint rustle of pages and footsteps in the distance, reminders that even in twilight, the machinery of the court never rests. Every whisper could be intelligence, every gesture a signal. Fredegund moves through it all, unflinching, aware of every eye and every heartbeat. And as you pause behind her on the landing, you sense her ultimate lesson. Power is never static. It must be nurtured, observed, manipulated, and defended in both grand battles and quiet corridors. Fredegund embodies this, and through her vigilance, she ensures that even in death, her influence endures. The moonlight catches the contours of her face, sharp and deliberate, and you realize that she is the living nexus of fear, respect, and ambition, a queen who made history itself bend to her will. Night deepens again, and you're drawn into the quiet of Fredegund's private garden. The air is damp with dew, and the scent of crushed herbs and flowering shrubs rises with each careful step. Here, away from the gaze of courtiers and enemies, she moves with the poise of someone entirely in command, yet still haunted by the consequences of her years in power. The mainstream fact: gardens in Merovingian palaces were not mere decoration. They were symbols of status, wealth, and control. Exotic plants, carefully tended fountains, and winding paths demonstrated a ruler's taste and power over nature itself. Fredegund's gardens reflected both her refinement and her ability to shape the world to her desires. Quirky tidbit. Some Chronicles hint she enjoyed unusual herbal concoctions for both health and intrigue, mixtures of mint, rue, and other strong-smelling herbs that served to mask scents, influence moods, or even test loyalty by offering suspiciously bitter teas. Imagine courtiers hesitating over a cup, uncertain whether sipping could signify obedience or doom. Historians still argue whether Fredegund's private rituals were for personal solace, political messaging, or psychological manipulation. Was she seeking calm among the roses, or subtly reminding visitors that even leisure could harbour danger? The ambiguity adds to her enduring mystique. You follow her along stone paths, glistening with dew. She bends to examine a bloom, her fingers, brushing petals with deliberate grace. Even in this quiet, you sense the calculation behind each step. Who sees her? Who is absent? Which flowers might be turned into tokens or poison? The line between meditation and strategy blurs seamlessly. Modern aside, it's a bit like walking. Through a Zen garden with a briefcase full of classified documents, you think it's serene, but every move carries intent. And Fredegund mastered that duality with perfection. Her life has been punctuated by scandal, assassination, intrigue, and warfare. Yet here, in the soft moonlight, she reflects the deaths she orchestrated, the alliances she twisted, the children she protected, and the throne she secured, all converge in this moment. The garden, silent and fragrant, becomes a place of contemplation and subtle power projection. She pauses at a small fountain, watching the water glimmer. Perhaps she imagines her legacy like these ripples, extending outward, touching every corner of Neustria and beyond. Perhaps she thinks of Brunhild, stepsons, bishops, and spies, the countless lives she has influenced, manipulated, or ended. Every ripple matters, every decision leaves a mark. And as you stand beside her in the quiet garden, it's clear that Fredegund's mastery lies not only in action, but in presence, whether orchestrating wars, navigating court politics, or surviving betrayals. She exerts influence simply by existing in the world with relentless awareness. The night winds through the hedges, carrying the faintest scent of roses and iron, and you realize she is above all a force of nature, a queen whose ambition, cunning, and survival instinct shaped not just her time, but the history that would remember her. The night has deepened into silence, and now you are led to the quietest corner of the palace. Fredegund's private study, where candlelight flickers over maps, letters, and accounts of her vast holdings. Here, all the threads of intrigue, ambition, and survival converge. This is where she measures her legacy, plans her moves, and ensures that the story of Neustria will bend in her favor long after her death. The mainstream fact. By the time of her death in 597, Fredegund had survived decades of assassination attempts, political rivalries, and family betrayal. Her son, Clothar II, ultimately ascended as the sole ruler of the Franks, a direct testament to her relentless efforts and strategic foresight. Her life and reign remain among the most discussed of early medieval queens. Quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest that she kept tiny figures of soldiers and courtiers on her desk, moving them around as if playing a strategy game. Modern readers might liken it to a mix between chess and miniature wargaming, except with real lives hanging in the balance. Imagine her, hunched over the figures by candlelight, muttering quietly, "Move him here. Remove her there." Historians still argue how much of Fredegund's legend reflects reality versus exaggerated storytelling. Was she truly the ruthless poisoner and schemer chroniclers describe, or did misogynistic perspectives amplify her notoriety? It's likely a mixture of fact, rumor, and narrative shaping that secured her place in history as both feared and remarkable. You watch her move. A small figure along a map representing the kingdom. Each gesture is deliberate. Who gains land, who loses influence, which alliance is favored. This act mirrors her larger life, every decision calculated, every move carefully weighed, every relationship manipulated to preserve her son's claim and her own position. Modern aside, it's like running a geopolitical simulation on a tablet while playing a live-action strategy game with real-world consequences. The stakes are incomparably higher, and the cost of error is permanent. Fredegund's life was defined by constant vigilance. Her enemies were numerous, her allies sometimes unreliable, and the line between safety and danger always thin. Yet she endured, navigating threats with both shrewd diplomacy and occasional ruthlessness. Even in her final days, she wielded influence, ensuring the continuation of her lineage and securing her own legacy. You see her pausing by the window, gazing at the quiet city below. Her eyes are reflective but alert. She understands the fragility of power and the effort it takes to maintain it. Her story is one of survival, cunning, and the indomitable will of a woman who refused to be overshadowed in a male-dominated world. And now, as you follow her one last time through the study, you understand the final lesson. History remembers not just actions, but the determination behind them. Fredegund's life was a masterclass in strategy, manipulation, and endurance. A queen who turned danger into power and ensured that her son would inherit a kingdom shaped precisely by her hands.